Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, Honorable Minister, Your Excellencies, all protocols observed. Oh, it's a bit louder. Okay, thanks. So, I know that, I'm standing between you and lunch, but I hope that my delivery will be a great appetizer for your lunch. So I'm supposed to speak on Africa's forests as our heritage, the urgency for sustainable forest management, restoration, and people. So colleagues, we all know about the importance of forests. The story is as old as the forests themselves. But today, that memory is fading. Every hectare lost is a story erased. Every tree cut without renewal is a future denied. We stand at a crossroads. Either we allow our forests to vanish into silence, or we rise together to sustainably manage and restore them as our heritage, as the foundation of our resilience and as a beacon of hope. Importantly, as we've been hearing yesterday and this morning, it is about the urgency to act now, not tomorrow. And let's not ask what forests can do for us, but what we can do for our forests. COP30 in Belém marked a major shift as forests moved from the margins to the center of the climate agenda. There was the Belém Pact, and as we heard earlier on, the launch of the Tropical Forest Forever facility, and stronger recognition of indigenous people and local communities. All this signals momentum in the right direction. Of course, it wasn't all perfect, as there was still no binding global roadmap to end deforestation. And finance for forests, particularly for the Congo Basin, remains well below what science and the economics demand, but still a step in the right direction. So the Zamba initiative, through its 4 programs, is well placed to contribute towards a roadmap to end deforestation. My presentation is about indigenous forests and trees, but it's also about people. And this is something that we've been hearing yesterday and earlier on today. It is about justice and equity. It's also about whether Africa's children will inherit deserts or thriving landscapes, despair or dignity. But critically, it's about transformative change as a pathway to addressing the underlying causes of forest and biodiversity loss. Nothing captures the idea of forests as our heritage better than a discussion with former President of Mozambique, Mr. Joaquim Chissano. A few years ago, working on a book on the Miombo woodlands in a changing world, we approached him to write a foreword to the book. And I just want to paraphrase our discussion as we sat down to talk to former President Joaquim Chissano. He said that most Africans of his generation were born in rural areas with a strong connection to forests, and that this connection was not a romantic one. He says forests were places of spiritual significance and a source of life supporting goods and services. He relates a story of when his family was inflicted by a disease that conventional medicines failed to cure. And he remembers being referred to a tree, and perhaps the colleagues from Mozambique would know this tree called Goana, Albizia ideanthifolia, that has medicinal properties as well as other uses. And he talked about how this tree, because of human pressure, urbanization, and so forth, has disappeared, except at the home of the local traditional healer. His encounter with the benefits of this tree, inspired him to plant the tree at his home And today, as we speak, this tree continues to benefit many, many people. Something that some of you may not relate to, he mentions, is that during the war, Mozambique's war of liberation, the forest would yet again prove vital for the survival of forces of liberation of Mozambique as we know it today. And he highlighted the value of people's traditional knowledge, forest management decisions. Your Excellencies, colleagues, and friends, when former President Joaquim Chissano spoke of Mozambique's forest, he reminded us that they are not just trees. They are living archives of our history, guardians of our culture, and anchors of our survival. He reminds us that forests are our cultural heritage, places with sacred groves for worship, groves for rituals, for burials, indigenous knowledge and practices, and oral traditions. Of forests as our ecological heritage, places that are the nucleus of water sources, carbon sinks, home to significant terrestrial biodiversity, and forests as our economic heritage, livelihoods, medicinal plants, timber, non-timber forest products, tourism, employment. And we've heard this from the presentations yesterday. The information about Africa's forests is known to all of us, and we listened to very powerful presentations from the countries yesterday, and outlined the values, the importance of these forests. And of course, all this is pointing to the issues of forests as our heritage. And I just want to remind ourselves of our heritage with a few headline numbers. And again, yesterday we heard some of these numbers. The extent of Africa's forests, 674 million hectares, representing 22% of Africa's landmass. And this is about 16% of the global forest area. In terms of terrestrial biodiversity, about 25% of global biodiversity is found in Africa's forests. And with respect to livelihoods, estimated that between 250 and 350 million people directly and indirectly depend on these forests. So quickly, where are these forests? In terms of regions, most of Africa's forests are found in sub-Saharan Africa. North Africa has the lowest share of Africa's forests, and the rainforests are found mainly in Central and Western Africa. Central Africa has 30% of Africa's forests, and Southern Africa 28%. And between these two regions, we have 65% of Africa's forests. The journey to sustainable forestry will undoubtedly face challenges. And it's good for us to reflect on some of these, because as we engage many of these initiatives, I think that we need to be internalizing many of these issues. Between 2000 and 2005, 10 countries globally were responsible for 71% of global deforestation. And 6 of those 10 were African. For 30 years, between 1990 and 2020, Africa remained the continent with the highest deforestation rate. And this is incredible, and we really need to ask ourselves, how is it that we continue to occupy this particular space? Regarding climate change, 2024 was the warmest year on record, and 2025 was only marginally cooler than 2023. And forests are low-cost mitigation solutions, as we've been hearing, to climate change, but they're also susceptible to global warming, as they cannot migrate. And so, with the velocity of climate change, I think we're going to see tremendous pressure on Africa's forests, and we need to begin to think, how are we going to manage these forests under worsening climate change or global warming? And what emerges clearly is that we cannot address climate change and biodiversity loss independently. So in a lot of our interventions, we really need to think about the connectedness between biodiversity loss forest loss, and climate change. And ironically, recent research coming out of Leeds University suggests that Africa's forests, long seen as low-hanging fruits in the fight against global warming, are now releasing more carbon than they store. This is a wake-up call that urgent action is required to halt and reverse deforestation. Due to the benefits, and I was listening to the discussion of the panel about the fact that these forests offer diverse benefits, and yesterday's presentations also highlighted this. The forests are contested spaces, and when you have contestation, you very invariably have conflicts between these competing demands, and we know the various demands that are placed on these forests. In these contested spaces, we begin to see the emergence of power asymmetries. And when you have power asymmetries, we see marginalization and limited participation of indigenous people, of local communities, youth, and women. And successful, sustainable forest management requires that we build from the bottom up, embrace indigenous knowledge systems, and not separate people from nature. Our current forest governance systems are not adaptive, they're not inclusive, and they're not accountable. And I think this was something that was captured eloquently by the previous panel. But one of the things, as I listened to the discussions yesterday around restoration, and I listened to the discussions around sustainable forest management, it's clear that we are dealing with complexity. Restoration is costly, yes. Not all restoration initiatives have the same costs and so on, but they are costly, they are complex. And so one of the questions that we need to deal with, or one of the challenges that we need to deal with, is whether the structures and the skills of forestry institutions are well placed to respond to this complexity. The challenges of deforestation, biodiversity loss, climate change, water, health, economics, these are all connected. But so often our solutions are not connected. We are plagued by a siloed approach. And this is something that we need to look at, this, what I call the sectoral arrogance. One of the biggest challenges for sustainable forest management is going to be funding. Funding remains the fault line of global environmental governance and action, and is being worsened by the weakening of multilateralism. We're now in the era of assetization and financialization of nature. Everybody is talking about carbon credits, and how they're going to be able to assetize their forests in order to mobilize resources for their countries. And this came across yesterday in the presentations and also from the panel. But weakening multilateralism will impact the global south. Finance will become political, it will become limited, and it will become more expensive, especially in the case of loans. And one of the challenges that we're going to face is the fact that Africa still struggles with the fact that although colonialism ended, colonial structures persist. Colonial economic structures were not designed for justice, for economic development, for prosperity, nor for equity. But these continue to influence how we trade, how we transact. And so really one of the things, as I move on, we need to engage with how do we look at the transformation of the economic systems. But Africa's biggest challenge is that it needs a key vision for itself. If not, we are always part of someone else's vision, and we are always responding to narratives that are not embedded in the reality of the African continent. Africa has a right to leverage its collective knowledge and also African narratives. Zamba initiative is well positioned to champion a vision for Africa's forests, and also African narratives for sustainable forest management. Left unresolved, these challenges lead to unsustainable and unequal outcomes for people, forests, with severe consequences to society. I want to just quickly look at the whole issue of the drivers, of deforestation, because the conversation around sustainable forest management and its urgency must begin with understanding our failure to halt and reverse deforestation and biodiversity loss. And despite our acknowledgement that forests play an important role in our lives, we continue to lose our forests at alarming rates. Of course, that is compounded by the funding challenges. So what are some of these drivers that we need to be considering and thinking about? And I want to focus on the indirect drivers of forest loss and biodiversity loss. And the reason for that is because the indirect drivers tend to be priority focus areas for policymakers. So yesterday we heard about population and demography. Africa is the second most populous continent after Asia, and the life expectancy on the continent is rising. So people are going to be living longer. Urbanization rate is quite high, 45%. Our population by 2050 is going to be 2.5 billion from the current 1.5 billion. And in sub-Saharan Africa, 40% of the population is 15 years and younger. These have major, major implications in terms of sustainable forest management. Globalization and markets. Local decisions can be influenced by global demand, and this can result in changing land use patterns. And so there was, yesterday we talked about the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, and so on, and how we can enhance our trade. But we need to be mindful of the ruptures that are taking place with respect to geopolitics, and the fact that we are no longer responding as a continent. We are responding country by country. We are lining up to be humiliated by the powerful powers that are part of this geopolitical rupture. Governance systems, again, weak governance can undermine rights and can also place forests at risk from those that want to operate outside of the law. And I'll come back to that towards the end. Trade and economics, policies and incentives to promote trade and investment. And often we overlook environmental impacts of some of these policies that are promoting trade, especially exports and inviting investors to come into the continent. Food production systems, and we also heard about commercial production like tobacco, critical minerals. Significant push around critical minerals. It's a very aggressive mining process on the environment, very dirty, and also uses a lot of water. And so we need to be thinking about this, and where do we find the right balance? The issue of income. So these are social and cultural things. The more people make, this affects the choices that they make. So we start to see overconsumption and waste. And the overconsumption and waste within the developed countries drives biodiversity loss within the global south quite significantly. Concentrated power and wealth. And as the Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney, said, speaking at the World Economic Forum, he said, the strong can do what they can, and the weak must suffer what they must. So we need to be thinking about this, that power can be used, not always best outcomes. The prioritization of short-term individual and material gains, again, this is can drive undesirable outcomes. For instance, as much as it is important for us to address immediate challenges today, we can't all be focused on just addressing today's problems. Some of us need to be thinking about the future. We need to be thinking about what is going to be the impact of what we're doing today with future generations. And again, this was something that was a theme that was emerging in the discussions yesterday. So I want to look at and propose a potential pathway to addressing the underlying causes of forest and biodiversity loss and leading us to sustainable forest management. And I want to pick on some work that was done by IPBES. And in November 2024, IPBES released 2 assessments. The first one was called the Nexus Assessment, and the other one was called the Transformative Change Assessment. And the discussion around these 2 assessments was also quite prominent at the SABSTA in Panama, SABSTA 27 of the CBD. And I think that the transformative change offers us a pathway to begin to get to the underlying causes of forest loss and biodiversity loss. And this is what they define transformative change as, that it is a fundamental system-wide shift in views, in structures, and in practices. That it is deliberate transformative change for a just and sustainable world, shifting these views and structures in such a way that it addresses the underlying causes of biodiversity loss and nature's decline. That transformative change is urgent, it's necessary, and it's possible, but it has to be deliberate. Not something that we can just hope, that it happens. And if the changes, the transformative change that we're driving is not addressing the underlying causes of biodiversity loss and nature's decline, then we are not going to see a difference, and our pathway to sustainable forest management is going to be a very difficult one. In terms of principles, they highlight equity and justice, inclusion, all of society, all of government, and engagement of all actors. And values. What are the dominant values that guide societal behavior and the choices that we make, individually, countries, as companies, as organizations, and finally, adaptive learning and action. And this is critical when we are talking about complexity. They propose 5 strategies, but that you have to implement all these 5 strategies. It's not a choice of saying, I'll take strategy 1 and 5 or 2 and 4, but that you've got to implement all these 5 strategies in order to bring about transformative change. And what is interesting is, as I listened to the discussions yesterday and today, many of the examples that we are hearing are on this pathway, and they might not be looking at all 5 strategies, but they all have elements of what is being proposed. So the first one is that conservation, the first strategy is conservation that involves sustainable stewardships, notably by indigenous people and other frontline communities. Again, this has been a consistent message that we've been hearing here, that for this strategy, focus on places that are of high value to people and nature, and that they deliver benefits that improve livelihoods. And this strategy has to be driven by empowered frontline communities. Number 2, transformative change in sectors that heavily contribute to biodiversity loss, and this would be in agriculture, in fisheries, forestry, infrastructure, mining. And the first thing is policy coherence, that we need to confront the siloed approach, this sectoral arrogance, and ensure that forests are prominent in all our plans, in the NDCs, in the NBSAPs, in all these national plans. And regulation. The government has a responsibility, has a role, has to regulate. It has to ensure that lending to investments that harm nature and people has to be regulated. And it has to monitor private sector investments that are using forests and biodiversity for their businesses. Not good enough just to say that they will self-monitor and self-regulate. How do we invest in agroecology, ecosystem-based solutions? And how do we guard against false solutions and greenwashing? There's a lot of capture of the right language. So, nature-based solutions gets captured, and everything is done in the name of nature-based solutions. But what is behind that language, I think, is very important. The third one is transforming dominant economic and financial paradigms so that they prioritize nature social equity over private interest. So here is this issue is that how do we reform the financial systems and institutions? They need to be fit for purpose. How do we regulate supply chains to prevent growth beyond ecological limits? No, we can't just continue to grow and have limitless growth. There is a point at which we really need to be questioning ourselves and this pursuit of growth beyond ecological limits, and it will not be sustainable. And we need to adopt matrices that are focusing on social equity, justice, and enforce the polluter pay principle. Number 4, moving towards inclusive, accountable, and adaptive governance. So, yeah, obvious, accountable. We need to hold sectors accountable. We need to hold countries accountable. We need to hold actors, leadership, accountable for their actions. Participatory processes. How do we co-create, co-monitor, co-evaluate, and how do we bring in citizenship, citizen science? And then the last one, shifting dominant societal views and values to recognize and prioritize human nature interconnectedness. And the issue of articulating African narrative is really important because these narratives are informed by stories. They're shaped by people's lived realities, what is happening in their lives. And it's also shaped by people's visions about the future and where they want to be. And these help for us to begin to define agendas that are linked to the reality, the African reality, and therefore have a greater chance of success. Co-creating knowledge. Coalitions are more effective for transformative change than when actors pursue change individually. And how do we start to weave together the different knowledge systems? Indigenous knowledge systems and formal science. They complement each other, so we need to find ways of bringing those together. And then lastly, changing educational curricula by introducing transformative learning. So I'm not going to touch on examples. I think we heard enough about this yesterday. And Excellencies and colleagues, I want now to conclude. We began with heritage, and I want to end with action and responsibility. Africa's forests are our inheritance, but they are also our gift to the world. They regulate climate far beyond our borders. They shelter species found nowhere else, and they sustain millions of livelihoods as a source of food, water, energy, medicinal plants, and so forth. Forests and biodiversity are critical to national and local economies. To lose our forests and biodiversity is to lose ourselves. To manage them sustainably enhances the resilience of society and forests and promises a prosperous future. We have seen that forest restoration works, especially when it builds from the bottom up, respects the rights of indigenous people and local communities, does not separate people from nature, and takes a rights-based, gender-sensitive approach. Our priority must be to sustainably manage our primary forests. Sustainable forest management should be more than projects. It should be movements of hope, proof that people and forests thrive together. Let us leave this Congress with a shared commitment and solidarity, a commitment to place people at the center, to mobilize resources boldly, to strengthen governance courageously, and to tell the story of Africa's forests not as a tragedy, but as a renaissance. Solidarity that is expressed through action and not emotion. Nothing is impossible. As Nelson Mandela said, it always seems impossible until it is done. So let us remember, let us restore, let us act. Act for heritage, act for prosperity, for justice, for sustainable forest management, for generations yet to come, and for the Zamba initiative. Bon appetit, and thank you.
Asante sana to Dr. Yemi Katerere. Actually, under his time, I don't know if there's anyone with a comment or appreciation or an addition, given opportunity for that. He has given a passionate appeal of our collective effort. If there is, I wouldn't take it away from you. I know you want lunch, but maybe there's a pressing issue. But we can carry it forward over lunch, and you could follow Dr. Yemi. Any question or any addition? Thank you. You could first try that mic right in front of you.
Okay, thank you very much, Yemi, for that presentation. I want to start with one of your concluding statements you've just made, that people and forests should live together. But Yemi, much as this is important, we also know that forests in Africa are affected by insecurity that results in forced migration and forced settlement, usually in forested areas, and therefore partly responsible for degradation, deforestation that requires a response to restore. Kindly give us your thoughts on this. How can we, what message do we have for governments in Africa, stakeholders in Africa that understand very well the insecurity and the causes, the forces that drive insecurity, that lead to deforestation, degradation, and loss of biodiversity? Share your thoughts with us. What should we do? What message should we send to them? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that, when we talk about insecurity, if we look back historically and how this insecurity has come about, if we look at the colonial period, we were told through science that we need to create protected areas, and that in the process of creating these protected areas, there was a lot of forced removal of people from their ancestral lands. And that is the beginning of insecurity, where people are displaced. And we impose a lot of top-down policies and laws in terms of how our nature, how our forests, how our biodiversity should be managed. And then we are surprised. And then you say, these people, we criminalize, we come up with laws, we separate people from nature. And that's the first principle that we need to embrace. Do not separate people from nature. We start to separate people from nature, and we start to see what we then call poaching, that people are poaching resources. So we disrupt people's ways of life. And even if we look at today, a lot of the initiatives continue, not so bluntly as the forced removals and violent removals of communities from their ancestral lands. It's a bit more sophisticated. We see now nature-enabled removals of people from the ancestral lands in the name of various forms of development programs, even the carbon projects. In some cases, there are no safeguards to prevent people from being displaced. The complexity of agreements that communities are entering into, they don't understand them. And before they know it, they've signed away their rights to these lands. So I think it's a complex thing. We have forests and biodiversity to talk of today, partly because of the contributions of frontline communities who live with biodiversity and forests, who understand the complexity of these things. We have a lot of wildlife, human-wildlife conflicts, where communities that are living adjacent to many of these protected areas are subjected to death-threatening situations from wildlife. There is no compensation, there's no loss and damage that is available to these communities, people who lose their lives, who lose their livelihoods in terms of agriculture. And we've encroached, as population grows, which is one of the, that's why I say, the underlying causes, underlying drivers, the indirect drivers of forest loss, the habitats have been shrinking. We've been encroaching on the habitats of many of these animals. And so we see the consequences of that, and it creates this level of insecurity. So that would be my explanation. I think let's not separate people from nature, and let's also understand the journey that has led to where we are, and that in many cases, science has contributed to some of the challenges we face. Thank you.
There's another one here. I think we'll have time for 3 more. Prof, will come to you.
Thank you, Doctor. I think we need people, a speaker like you. We have many people like you who can speak to the decision makers in this language, that forests are very important economically, ecologically, and socially. The political profile of natural resources sector or forest sector would have been different than this. And please continue, speaking on different stage. I kindly invite you to prepare yourself to the African COP. Ethiopia will be hosting COP 32, and you need to really organize a very special session where you demonstrate, the contribution of forests to the global economy like this, so that many people will listen to you. But my small request for you to reflect on this upstream and the downstream case. Like, in Ethiopia, for instance, we have been mobilizing our farmers, pastoral communities, and as a public resource, as a meager public resource we have to restore landscapes and forests. And as a contribution of these forests or restored landscape will significantly contribute to the downstream nations. In fact, we are doing this very lovely and from our heart, but what suggestion do you have that the downstream countries will come up and join the effort that have been done, on the birthplace of the water resource? For instance, we take Blue Nile. When, we have a very degraded mountains in Ethiopia, trust me, that river is going to stop. Those rivers flowing to the, Somali region, Turkana, South Sudan, Eritrea, many countries like, several transboundary rivers. But the more Ethiopia degrades, the more those rivers will be challenged, 20, 30 years from now. So what is your message on solidarity? Because you mentioned about solidarity, and how should we collaborate? Because we are also hydrologically connected, and we need to work together on that one. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that is really an interesting thing. And one of the things about transformative change is this acknowledgement that one of the problems is this, concentration of power, privatization of benefits. That this river, I have more rights to this river and to the benefits of this river than others, and yet we can actually work together and collaborate and see how best we can manage this shared resource. And I think that that's part of the challenge. And invariably, in those situations, you invoke the issues of power, and those that feel that they're more powerful, I think they begin to invoke their power. But I think that this is about transboundary resources, the recognition that in collaboration, we are likely to achieve much more than if we are working individually as individual countries. And this is it's a big issue for Africa, that we have, because we have the Africa Union Commission, but the Africa Union Commission is not a jurisdiction. Africa does not exist as a jurisdiction. And so how do you get 54 countries to move together around a particular issue when there is no framework that brings them, together. So if you look at, for instance, Africa, India, and China have the same populations. China and India are countries. Africa is not. So as a country, China or India, they can have a vision. They can move with agility to deliver the interests of their people. But on the African continent, we are going for country-by-country response, as opposed to how do we come together as an African continent, and how do we share, these resources. The discussion around carbon credits. One of the complaints on the African continent is the price of carbon, that is too low. And yet, we have no mechanism at the Africa level to ensure that the pricing of carbon is fair for all African countries. So project developers can go from country to negotiate a deal. And so we start a race to the bottom. And so we end up getting, bad deals. So how can we come together? And how do we begin to look at this? Look at the European Union. They can come up with a common agricultural policy. From 2024, you cannot export agricultural products into the European Union unless you can prove that those products were not produced from deforestation on the African continent. They have the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, to penalize those countries that have high carbon emissions in their production processes, so high tariffs and so on and so on. They can do that because they are jurisdiction, and that they can come together. So we need to be thinking about that. I mean, it's a big project, but how do we come together? How can we move 54 countries together with this shared vision? And unless we can do that as an African continent, even the talk about critical minerals, their criticality, we can't do that by country. We have to come together. And that's why Europe can produce Airbus and compete with Boeing. Now, we won't be able to produce lithium batteries unless we come together. So,
Dr. Yemi, I'm getting stares, but Professor Kiyapi, you have a mic in front of you, and you can utilize that. And then Luke will be the last as a voice of the youth. Go ahead.
Yemi, thank you for your very good reflection. I mean, you have taken me a little bit back to the 90s. But you also create very serious philosophical dilemmas. I think one of the issues you've mentioned, and maybe I didn't understand well, is that you said, for example, nature-based solutions have been hijacked. And then you have also talked about the issue of jurisdiction, which is very political and very important. But what do we do? How do we rally the continent? Do we just give up, or isn't there something we can do to create some direction, some force? Even given all the lessons that we have, like you and I have picked over the years, what are there no lessons that we can concretize and bring some solidarity in terms of direction and maybe forge an agenda forward? I'm just asking. Not that I think you have the answer, but
no, I think this is an important conversation for us to be having, because it's real, and we see it playing out. Right? Yesterday's discussion around the African Continental Free Trade Area, and we're trying to understand, why is it that there is no intra-Africa trade, and that was why this free trade area was created, so that you have greater African markets. Why isn't that happening? But what we see is that when there's geopolitical disruption, we are not acting as a continent. So we've been talking here that we talk as, we speak with one voice and so on. But when these disruptions were there and everybody had threats of tariffs 50%, 100%. And we were queuing up to go to the US individually to go and cut a deal, so country by country. And this undermines, the very notion of, as a continent, how do we speak as one voice? So when the chips are down, we turn to, what is in the best interest, of my country. And so I think this is a bigger question for the politicians. And I think that we need to be engaging with them and to be raising them and drawing attention to, things that are not working, why they're working, where we think that we can do a different job and improve that. And, and I've given examples. So on the issue of carbon prices, so the African Union said, no, we need to come up with some kind of continental framework on carbon trading. And so they had various meetings and they framed something. The question is, how do you enforce? How do you enforce that? How do you come up with a single policy on carbon trading on the continent that everybody buys into in the same way as, for example, the European Union can do and say, here is our common agricultural policy for the European Union. Everybody, or we go to the negotiations. The European Union can negotiate as a bloc. The UNFCCC at CBD, Africa doesn't because of that very issue. So how do we change this in order to change our engagement as a continent and to leverage greater benefits to the African continent?
Dr. Yemi, a last word from Luke, more of a statement, then we go for lunch. We'll be ushered by Mitch and Mary.
Yes, sorry, I won't take long. Yes, again, Doctor, my name is Luke, and I have a small statement to make. In your beginning of your keynote, you mentioned about the political structures, the colonial structures, sorry. To borrow my experience from yesterday, we had a meeting organized by the Pan-African Agenda. They were talking about that we cannot grow as Africans, particularly the African Union, because even the financiers of AU are not African. So it's something to talk about. Now, for today, what really actions are we really taking as a stakeholder engagement that can help us solve these problems of colonial structures? Because we need to grow as a continent. And from the youth perspective, our problems are not going to wait for long, but we do a lot of feasibility study and pilot sketching so that we can get solutions currently, particularly in this environment and value chain in these sectors. So is there a way that your executives has decided coming out with plans or ways that we can move from the political structure so that we can deal with our problems here and to promote sustainability within African continent? Because even if we start with free trade area across Africa, it is not possible for our smallholder farmers to do cross-border trades. It is not very realistic at the moment. So our priorities, what are they in terms of our development to increase the sustainability of the prevailing problems we have today?
Doctor, you want to leave it as a statement and leave it at that?
Yeah, I'll leave it as a statement. I was at a meeting and people kept addressing me as professor. By the end of the meeting, I started to feel like a professor, and I said, no, carry on calling me professor. And it feels good. But I mean, those are good observations, and I think that we can engage, if you want, talk more about those issues. But yeah, there are real issues. There are ways that we can deal with that. And I remember at one time, President Ruto was championing that we need transformation of the global economic system, that it needs to be changed. If we look at the whole issue of, for example, the issue of loans, okay? African countries borrow money at higher interest rates than their counterparts from the developed countries. Why? Because we are considered high-risk destination for capital. What are the implications of that? We end up paying significant percentage of our GDP in servicing those loans. And when we commit significant amounts of cash to service these loans, we divert resources away from investments in social services. And that is an important thing, that we need to deal with that. How do we confront that? Look at how many countries are in debt distress on the African continent as a result of this issue. We need to confront that and change the rules of the game. But as individual countries, we are too weak. Our economies are too small. We can't do it alone. That's why I said, if we want transformative change, we need to come together, the bloc. And we have a greater chance of bringing about change than if we're trying to do it individually, as individual countries. And so that is, the important issue. So let me leave it at that.
Thank you very much. A round of applause for Dr. Yemi. And it was indeed the appetizer that we needed just before we go for lunch. So